My favorite cities in the world is Prague, where we've visited 3 times. It's also an important place in Unitarian history, as it was where Norbert Čapek, the founder of the Flower Communion, had the largest ever anywhere Unitarian church. It's still there, but there's a long story about problems another time. We all know Čapek's story, ending with his death in a German concentration camp. But there is another man whose story is important to UUs who lived in Prague, Jan Hus. His statue is probably the largest in that city of statues, and it is certainly in the most prominent location, right smack in the middle of the large main city square. Hundreds of thousands of tourists each year pass by the statue and wonder, who was this man? It's especially intriguing to me that his statue be so conspicuous because Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, always was and still is primarily a Catholic country. The only things more prominent than the statue of Jan Hus are the spires of the many churches, especially St. Vitus, which dominates the bluff across the Vltava River on the grounds of the great castle complex. Yet our interest in Hus is because he was a heretic who opposed the Catholic Church. One would have expected him to be relegated to the quiet backwaters of Czech history. Hus was born in 1369, but we know nothing of him until he attended the University of Prague for degrees in philosophy, art, and theology. He wasn't an outstanding student. His professors complained that he wasted too much time playing chess and working his way through school by singing in the streets, as Martin Luther was to do 100 years later. Jan Hus was ordained to the priesthood in 1401. He wasn't much of an idealist. He wrote to a friend, "I choose the office of priest because I have in mind a safe shelter and goodly apparel and a comfortable living." At least he was honest. He was appointed rector of the University of Prague and was to preach in Bethlehem Chapel, which was the only church where the preaching was done in the people's own language so that they could understand and be nourished by religion. In all of the other churches, everything was said in Latin and for the priests alone. In Bethlehem Chapel, the house of bread, the word was for all people. Jan Hus was an enormous success with a thronged church. Of course, wasn't since the only game in town. It is recorded that on many Sundays, even the rafters were well inhabited. Another reason for his success, however, might be because he hardly ever mentioned theology. He spoke instead to the age in which he lived and to the feelings of the people who were standing and sitting there. As Hus put it, if God had intended himself to be revealed through theology, we would all have been born with doctorates. But troubles were brewing along with his success. Prague University, of which Hus was the rector, was run under an ancient system. The students and the faculty were counted according to their nation of origin, and university officers were then appointed proportionately. So German, French, and Italian students predominated, and thus their ethnic compatriots ran the whole university. Of the 10 trustees, only 1 was Czech. The town and the university were seething with unrest under this foreign rule, and the Czechs, under Hus, asserted themselves to gain control of the university, and the foreigners stormed out. Thus, Hus became the rector of a mere shadow of a university. But it grew again under his leadership and became at last a great university for the Czech people. The issue at the university was self-determination, local control, a familiar issue in many places, many times, even here in America today. But self-determination was an important issue in other ways in Hus's day. The Roman Church still owned over half of all land in Europe, and the church taxed the people heavily. The peasants had begun to notice their tax burden and to get organized against this all-consuming financial drain to a church that they were losing respect for anyway, what with the scandal of the papal schism. First, the Pope had moved to France. That was bad enough. Then there were 2 rival popes at a time, each filling every city with his own archbishop and bishops. Families often divided over which pope to support. And if you lived on one side of town but supported the other pope, you could wind up paying 2 lots of church taxes. An attempt was made to correct this mess at the Council of Pisa when Hus was 20 years old, and the church fathers united in electing one new pope. The trouble was, the other 2 refused to resign, and so then there were 3 popes. Criticism of the church increased, and of course, Jan Hus was one of the loudest critics. He preached against the wealth of the church. Looking across the river to the impressive castle and the large cathedral filled with gold and expensive art, and then looking at the poor people in and near his church, he begged the church to use its money for the benefit of the people rather than for the aggrandizement of power. By 1410, the church was beginning to get worried, and they ordered all books containing questionings of her authority and behavior to be burnt. That included several books by Jan Hus. All the authors were declared excommunicated. That was not a popular decision. In Jan Hus's own church, the Bethlehem Chapel, the Archbishop himself came to read out Hus's excommunication notice. And as he began to read it, Hus's congregants picked up the Archbishop, robes, mitre and all, and carried him straight out of the building, still pronouncing. Angered authorities took stronger measures. They said, unless Jan Hus stops preaching in Prague, every single bishop and priest in Prague will be killed by papal edict. So there. Well, now, Hus could hardly take such widespread murder onto his conscience, so he went into exile. Bethlehem Chapel was torn down to the ground by his enemies, though most of the stones were stolen by night from the rubble by Hus's supporters, and many of these rescued stones can still be seen today, built into the walls of our Unitarian churches in Czechoslovakia. Jan Hus in exile believed that he would be allowed to live out his days in peace, but his enemies were not satisfied. They were busy amassing all the evidence they could against him. His books were carefully read for heresies. His hymns, which had been sung in the streets as popular songs, were banned. Agents of his enemies followed him everywhere, even, as Hus complained, into the most privy of places. They hid behind the trees in his garden, taking notes on everything he said. Well, what did Hus say that was so bad, so dangerous? Well, bear in mind that in his day, prophets of the end of the world were very common and much believed. Indeed, the church itself was busy teaching that the end of the world was close at hand and very real. After the end of the world, of course, would come the resurrection for the elect sons of God only. This official church doctrine was comforting and gave hope to everybody, for the doctrine said that nobody could tell who the elect were until the end of the world came, when all would find out together. So until then, nobody knew, so everybody could believe that they were among the chosen. But Jan Hus was teaching that the elect sons of God were recognizable here on earth, right here, right then. Recognizable by their goodness, their moral lives, by the way they lived. Uh-oh. What's worse, Hus believed that it was these elect sons of God, the currently moral men, who ought to be the rulers on earth, starting right away, in preparation for the kingdom. Very threatening stuff. If goodness is the criteria, bye-bye kings. If morality, moral superiority is the criteria, bye-bye Pope. Dangerous stuff. And Jan Hus also taught that the communion bread and wine did not change into real flesh and blood in communion, but were simply symbolic, just a way of joining in the Last Supper of Jesus. Worse still, Hus went even further and taught that both bread and wine should be given to the congregation at Mass, to everybody, not just to the priests. And he found evidence in the Bible to prove it. By old tradition, only the bread was given to the lay people, while the priests had to drink up all the consecrated wine. Hus's heresy was thus a double one over communion. First, the heresy that bread and wine do not transubstantiate, change, become flesh and blood, and now this new demand of the wine for the people. An irate prominent churchman named Gerson pointed out 4 major objections to John Hus's idea of distributing the wine to the layfolk. If you listen carefully, you can hear the rustle of a stuffed shirt. First, some of the precious blood might be spilt by clumsy laypeople. Second, the blood might become contaminated by coming into contact with the beards of laymen. The beards of priests were okay because priests were consecrated. Third, the wine might become frozen as it was passed around a large church on a cold day. Evidently, Gerson lacked an understanding of the principles of antifreeze. And fourth, to pass both wine and bread might seem to indicate that priests and lay people were equal. And this last, of course, was exactly what Jan Hus intended it to indicate, that priests and lay people were equal. Hus's enemies moved. The exiled Hus was given a pass guaranteeing his safety if he would testify at the Council of Constance. If he did not, they said, the land of his exile would be attacked by the armies of all nobles supporting the Pope. Once again, Hus could not stand by and see other people butchered over his own fight with his church, so he went. The Council of Constance was a deliberative body to make suggestions for resolving the conflicts within Christianity. It was 1,000 committees. The normal population of the town of Constance was 6,000, and then came the 15,000 visitors. To Constance came officials of every church and court and all the merchants hoping for business. Just one statistic. At various times during the council, a total of 500 people drowned while swimming in the lake. It was some affair. Hus arrived with his safe conduct pass, hoping to be allowed to offer reasoned arguments for his premises and his positions. Instead, he was taken directly to a dungeon and chained hands and feet to the wall. So much for the guarantee of safety. He told his friends he was not surprised. Various officials came and yelled at him. His friends barely managed to get him hearings in court before sentencing. He never was permitted to make a single appearance before the Council of Constance, which had supposedly called him there. At his court hearings, some of his enemies were the same foreign teachers and officials that Hus had removed from power at Prague University many years before. Hell hath no fury like an academic scorned. Although 250 nobles signed a petition pleading for Hus's release, and even though the court was forced to admit that wine had in fact been given to all men and women in early Christianity, still they condemned Hus. His trial was not really a trial at all. It was a dramatic performance, pure intimidation. to discourage his followers from having anything more to do with him or his ideas. At the last hearing, on July 6, 1415, Hus was forced to dress up in all his priestly vestments and was handed a communion chalice of wine. The charges were read, Hus was convicted, and as they tore the priestly robes from his body, the accusers rudely and symbolically grabbed the chalice out of his hands with the words, "We take from thee the cup of redemption." Good dramatic stuff. And that, folks, is the source of our chalice. The cup of communion of fellowship for all people. The chalice, a symbol for the power of the universe, of life, of God, freely given to all people. The chalice, a deeply religious, revolutionary belief in the equality of all people. This is what rests in our religious symbol. Now at this point, the drama sputters into bitter comedy. They wanted to cut Hus's hair to disfigure the traditional Mongol tonsure cursor circle at the top of his head, but they got into an emotional argument about whether it was theologically more proper to use a razor or scissors for the purpose. They couldn't agree, so they dropped the idea. On to tragedy. Hair intact, Hus was taken out and burnt at the stake with all of his books. The first doctor of theology in all of European history to be martyred for his faith. As he was burnt, Hus made a pun on his own name, which meant goose in Czech. "Today," he cried, "today you are burning a goose, but the fat from this goose will fuel the fires of freedom forever." And so the flame joined the chalice and became a symbol of a great movement in Bohemia and Eastern Europe and into Transylvania. The chalice of communion and respect for all people, and the flame of the death, but even more of the life and the spirit and the thought of Jan Hus. 450 nobles joined the movement to keep Hus's flame alive. They deposed the treacherous king and formed a city of some 40,000 Hussite souls. In 1433, they forced the church to a treaty which allowed the giving of the wine in communion in the chalice to all people. They and many of their followers all over Europe wore the symbol of the flaming chalice as a badge on their cloaks, as a means of recognition, a sign of who you were and what you believed. It was a common sight. Martin Luther adopted most of Hus's ideas and even once made the nearly incredibly familiar statement, "We are all Hussites without knowing it." Jan Hus and the flaming chalice are not forgotten in the Czech Republic today. His statue, as I've said, still stands in the Old Town Square. It was no coincidence that Jan Palach years ago chose to protest Russian occupation by burning himself to death, sitting at the feet by that statue of Jan Hus. And not far from the reconstructed chapel of Bethlehem, the House of Bread, on a brick wall, during the Czech upheaval, appeared a chalked, flaming chalice, and under it the words of Jan Hus, "Pravda vitezi," truth is victorious. And under those words, the numbers 2-0, 4-3, the scores of the ice hockey matches when Czechoslovakia beat Russia. We Unitarian Universalists are not the only ones to honor Hus. We have kept the chalice. We have just forgotten the story. A pamphlet put out by the UUA tells of the chalice becoming our symbol in 1948, designed by one Hans Deutsch as the logo for the Unitarian Service Committee. Well, where do you think Deutsch got the idea? And why did Theodore Parker, American Unitarian hero of the 19th century, order a flaming chalice carved on his gravestone? The chalice of equality, of revolutionary ways of viewing one another as equally powerful, important, and beautiful people, and the flame of new thought and courage. Hus was not a Unitarian. His fight with the Catholic Church was not theological, but social, political, economic, and rooted in justice. It was a fight for equality and rights that is very similar to ours. It's a shame we do not honor him as one of our historical martyrs and exemplars, for much of our meaning comes from him. There's modern relevance to this slice of history. Hounding people, eavesdropping, lifting one religious view above all others, courtrooms used as theater, the issues of self-determination, the freeing of people from the idiocies of unreformed institutions, the oppression of high taxes, these issues and the general demands of ordinary people to govern their own lives, these issues still exist in Hus's homeland today, and here in America, and everywhere in the globe. To others, our chalice might seem to be more than a pretty design. But in this place, and in all UU churches throughout the world, we are serious about its meaning. One of the things that I like about it is that it lends itself to different designs and interpretations. The Universalists had as their symbol two intersecting circles, representing universality and the circle of life, with a small cross placed off-center at the bottom. And when the two groups merged, the chalice replaced the cross, also slightly off-center, and we had a new symbol with richer meaning. Your chalice is one of the best that I have ever seen. I don't know who made it, and I've asked several people, and nobody seems to know who made it, but it is amazing. It has all of the elements strongly portrayed, and it's just beautiful. And I understand that soon you are to receive a chalice painting to hang on your wall. So obviously you do cherish the chalice. Over the years, many artists and jewelers have modified these symbols in interesting ways, as in the one hanging up there. This idea was used as the backdrop for the meetings at one of our General Assemblies. It was rendered in colored cellophane, about 10 feet tall. My son and I attended that GA, and I loved it so much that I asked him to make a stained glass copy of it. He's a professional stained glass artist in Chicago. When I became the minister in Hanscom, Minnesota, it hung in one of the front windows of that country church, which had no other stained glass. And now it can hang here for as long as you wish. I find the addition of the idea of peace and the phoenix rising in the chalice very compelling. So enjoy. The closing hymn is number 287, Faith of the Larger Liberty.